So the colonies that were created, or in the case of New York, essentially taken by from the Dutch in the 1660s, those were called the Restoration colonies. So this is after the monarchy is restored in England. There are these new colonies, which include the last two that we talked about from the class on Friday. That was colonial Carolina, that was all one colony, and Pennsylvania. Again, they all have their unique backstory. If you know anything about these colonies, you're beginning to understand that. Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland. We talked about the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, New Netherlands, which the English basically took from the Dutch. And that's going to coordinate with today's story as well. Then we have those other two restoration colonies. So the English are trying to exert more political control. Some of it is successful, some of it isn't. But at the end of the day, the American colonies govern themselves in many ways. They have their own, in many cases, legislature or a type of governor and a council. And all of the shots are not called directly from England, which is different from the Dutch and the Spanish examples of North America, where the Dutch and the Spanish are a lot more hands-on. You know, they appoint who the governor is going to be. They select the council and the advisors around that particular governor, who's usually a military man in the case of the Spanish or the French or the Dutch. Not always the case with the British. Different colonies have different stories, and their experience literally is how they make decisions about how to govern themselves. And the English tend to leave them alone, except in areas of economic control. We're going to talk today about the Navigation Acts, which are passed by Parliament. Parliament is the equivalent, not the exact equivalent, of the English Congress. That has a House of Lords, the nobility, House of Commons. Those are the people's representatives in England. They have to work with the monarch, with the king. Again, we now know that the monarchy in England is very limited, but that was not always the case. The limits on the monarchy, the queen now, it's a queen, is essentially something of a figurehead. They don't have a lot of power. The power shifted to the parliament and the prime minister. A lot of people realize the prime minister, he or she would call a lot of the shots in England. But parliament will pass legislation, and that legislation governs the colonies. We're going to talk about a series of navigation acts that started in 1660. So it is the year of the Restoration when the monarchy returns to England. There are three major themes for the navigation acts. And this makes sense if you're England. You're trying to take these colonies, which are created at different times by different individuals, a lot of whom are not even English, who live in the English colonies. Put that in quotes because not everyone there is actually English by race or by birth. The first major theme of the Navigation Acts, again, to make the colonies more profitable for England. That's why they were created for England anyway. The first Navigation Act decides that it's going to insist, the English Parliament, that only English ships can trade with English colonies. This is a way to keep the Dutch out of English North America. The Dutch traveled to the American colonies, to places like Virginia. And as far as the Virginians are concerned, they could care less what ship shows up to get their tobacco out of the colony of Virginia. French, Dutch, English, who the hell cares? When our tobacco is in the barrels waiting to be sent back to Europe, we need it done quickly before it rots, before it spoils. So the Dutch come in, and the Dutch, as we know, are kind of a latecomer to the race to create colonies. But when they arrive with a splash and make an impact immediately. So the Navigation Acts are really to squeeze the Dutch out of North America. The Dutch encourage the English colonists to smuggle. That means avoid bringing American products in English ships. And that's why the first set of the Navigation Acts were passed. It doesn't matter to you if it's a Dutch ship, it's going back to Europe, you're going to get your credit, you're going to get your ability to borrow money or to purchase things, whether it arrives in a Dutch or an English ship. But the first set of Navigation Acts are to literally force the Dutch out of colonial North America. The second set of Navigation Acts, which begin in 1660, are around the theme of making sure that only certain products that are grown or made in the English colonies go back to England. That's the second theme. Certain items exported, and in one particular case, they say tobacco. Tobacco comes out of where? Virginia and Maryland, the Chesapeake colonies. So the English in their second set of navigation acts say that those products can only go back to England. Again, England's losing money if Virginia tobacco goes back to France or to Spain or to the Netherlands. They can't regulate it and they can't tax it if it goes in a non-English ship or to someplace in Europe that isn't England. This makes sense. So every few years, they put that in the books. They say tobacco, and they might say rice, and they might say indigo. Rice, as we know from Friday's class, the dominant crop in South Carolina, grown by African slaves who increasingly became the majority of the population by 1710. The third theme of the Navigation Acts is a way to control trade. This makes sense if you're England. This is, if you've ever taken economic classes, this is mercantilism. Make the parent or mother country or fatherland, if you want to call it that, benefit from the colonies. This is what they do in the third part of the Navigation Acts, which essentially say that all European goods which go to the colonies, if it's made in Spain or France or in the Netherlands, it has to pass through an English port. Why? You can regulate it and tax it if you're the government. It makes sense. You know, back before any English man or woman had set foot in North America, whether it be the lost colonists in Roanoke or the Virginians or the Congregationalists who go to Massachusetts, people predicted in England that if you plant people, planting crops was second priority, if you planted people in the New World, you would create a permanent marketplace for English and European goods. Goods that are only made, finished goods. The colonists are scraping out an existence by building houses out of tree bark and sticks and mud. But eventually, they're going to want the finer things that they left behind in England. Mirrors, furniture, clothing. And guess what, folks? They ain't making that in the colonies. So the colonies and the colonists specifically will be a market, a constant market for European and English-made goods. So if it isn't made in England, that's okay, the English say. It's got to go through an English port. And so begins a process for the next 100 or so years where the American colonists become very skilled at smuggling. Smuggling means looking at those laws and saying, nah. I mean, laws are only as good as they are enforced. Again, you can put speed limit signs, but if you never see anyone pulled over, it doesn't matter. You can race up at Interstate 49 as quickly as you like. The same with these things that apply the different regulations in the Navigation Acts. So there is smuggling. It's encouraged by the Dutch. The English try to crack down on it. And so begins a process which lasts 100 or so years. They will eventually add more laws. You know, it's kind of like a modern equivalent, if I could give you one. When the internet started, and then people started selling things on the internet, and we have, this is all something you take for granted, but this was new once upon a time. The government, in this case, the United States Congress, had to say, well, we're going to have to regulate this. And the joke always about the government is that if they can find a way to slow it down or tax it or make money off it, they will. At first, there was no such thing as tax on items that you bought from your computer on the internet. And then the states governments and the national government said, well, yeah, we need to, you know, catch up with the changes. What about privacy laws with your smartphone? How should those be regulated? So things happen, in this case, the development of the colonies, and sometimes the government has to catch up to regulate that. And we can understand that in a more modern setting by the examples that I just gave you. So this is step one, exert more economic control over the colonies. The English also want to exert more political control, but they have a little bit more trouble with that because of two events that take place by coincidence in 1675 and 1676. The first is called King Philip's War, and this is a reference to an Indian in New England whose name, his Indian name is Metacom, or sometimes it's known as Metacomet. But Metacom, to the whites in New England, he's known as King Philip. He leads an assault against several areas of New England along the frontier in Connecticut and Massachusetts, beginning in 1675. Metacom was an Indian who said, look, we've given up all this land to the villages and towns in Massachusetts and greater New England. Those white settlers have forced us to adopt Christianity when we haven't wanted to. And at one point, there was a friendly Indian to the whites in Massachusetts who was killed. And so the authorities in Massachusetts said, well, we're going to literally find some of the people we think are associated with this crime, bring them in, and they were actually hanged. 2 Indians were hanged because of their connection to the murder of this praying town or Indian who was friendly to the whites in Massachusetts. And that kind of is the spark that begins this conflict. Again, Metacom and his allies completely catch the New England colonists by surprise in 1675 and 1676. In short order, 50-odd villages in New England, especially in Massachusetts, which is hard hit, are destroyed. King Philip's War, as it's called, it lasts for about 14 months. So this is a significant conflict, and it shows us the tension that was brewing between Indians and colonists in New England. It had been there for 40 or so years since the end of the Pequot War in the 1630s, and now all of a sudden it explodes. Simmering tensions, a powder keg ready to go off, and it goes off with a huge explosion. We think that upwards of 2,000 colonists may have been killed in this conflict. As a percentage of the population, this was absolutely devastating. It is by far the bloodiest war in colonial history up to that point. I mean, the casualties, especially for Native Americans, which could have been as high as 4,000, were very high. So caught off guard, the different authorities and the military force in New England, which is called militia. Militia is made up of any able-bodied man who's 16 up to 60 years old, who can literally march, have a gun. They would have recruited militia. They would have also brought in allies to the New England colonists. They recruited Indian allies. Indians fought each other during King Philip's War, and the Indians taught the New England colonists how to fight Indian style in ways of the woods, ranging through the woods. That's how we get the Rangers associated with the American military to this day. And it began to turn the tide in 1675. Again, 50-odd villages destroyed. The frontier pushed farther and farther towards the East Coast. Boston at one point, they thought they would have to basically turn the city into an armed camp because of all of the victories and all of the destruction that was happening during the last several months. Out of the 4,000 or so Indians who were killed in King Philip's War, Metacom was one of the casualties. He was actually captured, and that's where the authorities in Massachusetts said this will end if we capture King Philip himself. They do. They eventually behead him, put his head on a pike, which is a very popular English thing to do when you are fighting rebels. The English did it to the Irish, to the Scots, to anybody else who they faced. They also did it to the leaders of slave rebellions, one we'll talk about in the future in South Carolina, line the road of the main road into town by those rebels, whether they be Irish Indians or African slaves. And this was a way to show everybody, okay, this is how we deal with it. And this showed New England and the English back in England how these colonists dealt with any kind of, again, violent reaction to their settlement. King Philip's wife and children were sold into slavery, into what many considered hell on earth in the British colonial world. That was, of course, the Caribbean islands, the Sugar Islands. We talked about how those were set up because of the cash crop of sugar when we discussed Carolina. So here we have in England trying to bring about more political control, and 2 of their oldest colonies, Massachusetts and now Virginia, we're going to switch gears and talk about that colony. 2 of their oldest colonies have this sustained explosion of violence. It's an Indian fight in areas of Massachusetts and New England. In Virginia, it is about tobacco. and the settlement of that colony. Tobacco had dominated Virginia ever since it was planted in the 16 teens. Let's go back and we'll show you, let's see, a slide here. And this is good. Let's see if we can get this to come up. Looking at the organization of Virginia, how critical it was. Again, tobacco does everything. It literally is the way that the colony develops. So we can get this to work. Maybe, maybe not. Okay. Yep. There we go. Okay. Let's scroll down here. So with Virginia, everything is about getting land, the good land, as close as you can along the coastline. You can see it here in this slide. Let me make the slide a little bit bigger for us to see. Here we go. Okay. So the development of Virginia, the settled land along the coast, this is where you want to grow tobacco because it gets you near what? All the waterways. That gets you the tobacco out into the Chesapeake, out into the Atlantic, and boom, you're now connected to the markets across the Atlantic. Well, in 1675 and 1676, the conditions in Virginia were good for some people, but not good for everyone. As an example of that, the rich were doing fairly well, but some of the others, there were a lot of people who were struggling. And that's why we have this conflict. Those who were the very wealthy tobacco planters were making sure that they had the best land, the most indentured servants. Those new arrivals to Virginia were struggling. You had an increasing number of folks in the colony who were poor, they were landless. A lot of folks in Virginia had come there with the idea of getting land at the end of their indenture. We talked about for decades, the early migrants to Virginia, men and women were indentured servants. At the end of their time, they were promised free land. But the leadership of Virginia said, we're going to take that land at the end of your indenture away. We're going to prevent former indentured servants from voting. So it's a bad situation. You're forced further and further west into the interior, the central part of the colony. You have no land. Tobacco is very competitive. It's great if you live along the coast and you have good land and a lot of servants. You can manufacture tobacco and export it and make money. But if you don't, you're going to struggle. So it's an increasing population in the 1660s and 70s, as I say here on the notes. You're impoverished. The answer you're given to the leaders by the leadership of Virginia is kind of just move farther west and maybe you can grow enough crops for yourself or you can raise animals, but you're not being part of a very productive tobacco economy. So you're impoverished, you're frustrated, former servants. This is what causes what we label in Virginia at this time Bacon's Rebellion, because it refers to the leader of those who were increasingly unhappy, disconnected, and they were, again, trying to tell the governor of the colony, maybe you should address this situation. Open up more lands for us in the West. Maybe if you have to make treaties with the Shenandoah Indians, but give us access to land further into the interior of the colony, or economically, we're going to suffer. And their demands and their grievances fall on deaf ears. The governor of the colony is a man named William Berkeley. This guy's completely, this is a textbook definition of an out-of-touch politician. He's been in the position of governor, appointed by the king. Virginia is a royal colony for decades. And what does he do? He appoints all his friends and cronies to very important positions within the colony, from dog catcher to associate justice or whatever. And all of these well-to-do connected people with Berkeley are also wealthy tobacco planters. They don't want the competition from the newly freed indentured servants. So they strip them of land, they strip them of the right to vote, and Berkeley goes on to say, oh, woe is me, I'm governing a population of people who are angry and they're landless and they're armed. He should have paid attention to the armed part because they were really in a bind. So it shows the downside of tobacco. Tobacco is like the gold rush, I said, when it was first planted. It's like California in the 1840s. It's like, holy cow, the world just descended on California. Everyone's looking for gold. Only a few people find it. Those who suffer are a lot of the indentured servants and, of course, the Indians, who come increasingly under attack by settlers who are drifting more and more to the west. And that's when these folks who are the landless, former indentured servants appeal to the governor. And they say things like, well, if you could build some forts out west that would keep us safe from the Indians who counterattack when we go and kill them. And the governor says, well, yes, but, forts are expensive and that will force me to raise taxes. And they say, no, we don't really want you to do that either. So into this situation comes a man named Nathaniel Bacon. That's why we get the term in Virginia history of Bacon's Rebellion. And this isn't just an incident where it's fun to talk about, and you have to, because when you discuss Virginia, Bacon's Rebellion comes up. We're going to tie this directly to what happens in Virginia after the 1680s, where the colony decides possibly to make a conscious decision that instead of indentured servants, white men and women who've served part of their life to really grow tobacco and then they're free, maybe we should shift to a population that we can control a lot better, like slaves from Africa only and not indentures. So that's why the Bacon's Rebellion story is important. Also, people hear the word rebellion and they think, oh, this is something against England itself. It's not. Bacon's Rebellion, and Bacon comes into the colony in 1675, and he quickly recognizes the way you get influence and wealth and power is that you get close to Governor Berkeley. But Berkeley kind of keeps Bacon at a distance. So Bacon has his ear to the ground, recognizing what's going on in the colony, and he hears the complaints and the grievances and the economic struggles of those former indentured servants who don't have any land, they're impoverished, they're pushed farther and farther west, and they're armed. And he promises, I will attack and kill all Indians in the West. To which Berkeley says, no. As a side business, Governor Berkeley says, I've got a treaty with Indians in Virginia who bring me deerskins. We know that the deerskin trade was one of the early founding industries of Carolina in the 1670s and 80s. Often you ally yourself and bring Indians European goods. They bring you deerskins for clothing, to bind books, and for other items, and they go back to Europe. So when all of a sudden Bacon says, I'll kill every Indian out there in the frontier, Berkeley says, no, they're friendly with me. That would be disastrous. And so the governor, Berkeley, says, Bacon is I declare him a rebel against the interests of the colony. To which Bacon says, oh yeah, Governor Berkeley, you're a rebel, and not in the interests of the greater good of the colony. And so you see attacks by Bacon's rebels against Indians. He promises that he will free indentures. He promises to also give freedom to the few, there aren't many yet, African slaves in the colony of Virginia, which stirs up a lot of animosity and danger among Virginians. And then when Berkeley says, Bacon, you're a rebel, you're committing treason against this colony, Bacon turns east and destroys plantations and farms of those who are very loyal to Governor Berkeley. And that's when he goes after and targets, he actually burns Jamestown, the old first colonial village town now, the fort that had been there since 1607. But after what seems like a military success by Bacon and his army of rebels, white and black, Bacon dies. A fever or something, we're not entirely sure, and the rebellion kind of comes apart. Berkeley and his own militia, his own force of soldiers raised right there in the colony, because the English don't keep soldiers in the colonies. The militia that's fighting King Philip's Indians are New Englanders raised in New England, as are those soldiers loyal to Governor Berkeley. Well, they capture a lot of those associated with Nathaniel Bacon, and the governor executes about 24 of them. This is even too much for the king. The king calls Berkeley an old fool for executing so many rebels associated with Nathaniel Bacon, who's already dead. And the king decides, look, we got to end this here. And he demands that Berkeley return to England. The king can do that. The king appoints the governor in several of these colonies, and especially in Virginia. And he recognizes that Berkeley had been in power too long. He was tone deaf, wasn't really interested in what was taking place in the colony. So he's brought back to England and replaced by another royal governor. The legislature of Virginia then decides they're going to lower the taxes on tobacco. They're going to begin to listen more and more to that disgruntled, angry, impoverished, landless, and armed group of the population, so they don't have another Bacon's Rebellion. And then maybe, and this is up to a lot of speculation by historians, maybe those that lead Virginia within the colony itself make a conscious decision that it might be better for us not to rely on indentured servants, but instead to make our labor force that one that we can control more. And that might be one of the reasons why after 1680, we're on the end now of Bacon's Rebellion, Virginia begins to rely more and more on African slaves coming into the colony. There are, and this is one of those things that you're thinking, well, it's been what, almost 400 years, haven't we figured this out yet? And the answer is no. There are still, in history, active debates about the past. Why did Virginia rapidly accelerate from all of a sudden having a few slaves and a lot of indentured servants to not as many indentured servants and a lot more slaves? Was it Bacon's Rebellion? Was it other factors operating around the world? That could have had an impact as well. Some of the factors are listed there in the notes. First of all, there are less people coming to Virginia as indentured servants. White English men and women can go to other colonies. They can go to Pennsylvania, brand new colony. Carolina, maybe you like the sandy shores of the Caribbean. If you're an indentured servant, Virginia isn't the only destination for you anymore. Maybe you'd like living amongst the Congregationalists in Massachusetts and New England. You have options, in other words. So the availability of indentures to Virginia, maybe that's declining. We think that is probably one of the factors. There's also, and this is one of the elements in this story, when the economy improves in England, there's less of a push to get people out of England to go and do something desperate like sign your name or just sign an X if you're probably not literate to an indenture and go over, cross the Atlantic in a horrible voyage across the Atlantic and become an indentured servant in Virginia. There might be other places to go. There might be other options for you. Stay in England, join the British military, the Navy or the Army. The British military forces are becoming much larger, so they can take on the French and Spain, sometimes together if they have to. They are also fighting increasing naval conflicts with the Dutch. The Dutch and English were sometimes allies, but when you're talking about money, all bets are off. And so the increased size of the Royal Navy would give people who have few opportunities. In other words, they might enlist in the military. Or they just did it because they thought slaves would be easier to control than indentured servants. Well, it has certain advantages. First of all, if you can get all the indentured servants you need, you probably wouldn't change. Probably wouldn't change your main labor force. But if the number of available indentured servants began to shrink, if the price, you have to think of economic factors. Slaves died as frequently as indentured servants, and they stayed in the colony just as long. So economically, and they cost more, it doesn't make any sense. But then the English and other companies in England and the Dutch began to send more ships to West Africa and bring more Africans to the New World. The price began to decline. It became a little bit more, not a lot more, a little more, to purchase a slave and to purchase an indentured servant. So you have to make that economic consideration. Africans had been in Virginia since 1619. We talked about that with the discussion of Jamestown. We called it the Black Mayflower in 1619. The 20-odd Negroes, as the actual manifest on the ship said, the inventory of the people on the Dutch ship. Yet, slavery hadn't really blossomed in Virginia until after Bacon's Rebellion. And then the government of Virginia begins to change some of the laws. Early on, when the number of servants is high and the number of slaves, and slaves weren't even defined as slaves. To be an African in Virginia didn't mean you were necessarily a slave. You probably were treated as an indentured servant. You could intermarry between the races. You could serve on a jury. You could serve in the militia. They needed everyone. It was all hands on deck when it came to any threat to the colony. So white and black were enlisted in the militia. You had, in other words, civil liberties. And then the number of slaves began to increase. And the number of indentured servants began to flatline, not as many. Purchase more slaves. Then the colony, Virginia itself, begins to change the code, the legal code for slaves in Virginia. We're used to, in 2020, a one-size-fits-all policy because Congress makes the laws in Washington, D.C., and a lot of them apply directly to the states. We used to have a national speed limit law, believe it or not, during the oil crisis of the 1970s. It was 55. Oh, can you imagine? 55, because you weren't supposed to, I mean, the government said it and all the states followed it. We have national holidays. In the 1980s, before I think just about all you were born, the governor of Arizona said, no, I don't think the Dr. Martin Luther King holiday is going to apply to Arizona. President Reagan said, I don't think you're getting any highway money this year. And the governor said, I've changed my mind. So we're used to that. I mean, from up high, we get these different orders from Congress and regulations and laws and all that. But there's nothing like that that applies to the American colonies with the exception of the Navigation Acts. There isn't someone on Parliament or a law of Parliament saying, from this day forward, this is how the laws relating to slavery work. The colonies passed their own individual laws. From the get-go, South Carolina had whites and blacks together because they came together from Barbados in the Caribbean to Carolina. Massachusetts passes a slave code in Massachusetts? Yes, about 3% of the population was enslaved in New England. Virginia, when they begin to purchase more Africans, they change the laws and say, okay, maybe we can take advantages of some of this investment that other colonies were doing. To be a slave meant to be a slave for life. They changed the law. The children of the slaves would be slaves as well. See, remember, this was not written out anywhere and was automatically done. Certainly not in Africa, where it was generationally, it was not the case. And if you were a slave, your children were born slaves as well. This happened in Virginia. Well, it doesn't make any sense that you would have this increased population. You have guns, so you disarm slaves. You segregate them. You don't allow them to gather in meetings. And when they do gather in any kind of meetings, whether it be a church service or anything else, white people have to be present to supervise and watch. Because no doubt when all the slaves are gathering, they're talking about ways to kill the white people. That's the mindset of the people in Virginia. So they begin to make it very clear. To be a slave meant to be a slave for life. You're going to devote your life would be forced to where you were developing, for the most part, tobacco in Virginia. And whites in Virginia began to find a commonality. It's been called by one historian said it's a psychology of color. To be white meant to be free. Look, if you are the poorest dirt farmer, indentured servant in Virginia, you have no shoes, you have nothing to your name except the sweat of your brow, you're not a slave, because more and more the laws change. And this happened over the decades of the 1680s and 90s. I mean, I could read you all the different laws, things like if a owner frees a slave, the owner must pay to make that slave leave the colony. Like if a slave owner said, either because of my financial situation or because I'm just suddenly opposed to slavery, I'm going to free or manumit my slaves. You can do that, the laws say, but you have to pay to move that slave out. That African American who's in your colony, who you used to own, must leave the colony because they don't want to have any gray areas. To be black meant to be enslaved. Maybe it meant to be a former indentured servant. Maybe you were a free man or woman of color, or maybe you were a slave, one of three different Virginia wants to eliminate that gray area. The psychology of color. That means a lot because it's going to lock that psychology in until obviously the American Civil War, where most Southerners don't own slaves. But those that do, tell folks who don't, if Lincoln gets his way, we free the slaves, it's all over. You can talk about a race war the next day happening. So this is cemented back in Virginia in the decades after Bacon's Rebellion. By 1750, just to give you kind of a statistic and to let you know that only South Carolina is the only British mainland colony with a black majority, but there are more slaves in Virginia than any other colony. By 1750, almost half the population, upwards of about 40%. In South Carolina, just to give you that comparison, it's possibly 2 to 1, especially in areas where rice is grown along the low country. So this is kind of repeating and giving you a synopsis of the idea that this process is instantaneous in Carolina, where they write a slave code early on, because slaves are there in Carolina from the get-go. In Virginia, it develops slowly, especially after Bacon's Rebellion. Remember, if you keep slavery in as your main force, you don't have to free slaves. You can make them slaves for life. They will not be free and compete against you in the tobacco market, which is already limited because tobacco by the late 1600s in Virginia is riding a roller coaster of prices. So the last thing you need is more people planting tobacco and then increasing the supply that's out there. And then demand will go in the tank, and then your economic fortunes are, of course, done for. And if you never have to free slaves as you had to free the indentures, you could control them more, and the control happens. Race relations are fluid from 1619 up until Bacon's Rebellion, and then they begin to change dramatically. Those laws we have records of them being on the books, handing down. The status of the mother will be handed down to the child. Slaves cannot testify in court. They cannot intermarry. Sexual relations between the races would be punished as well. All of that, it's to exert total control, which begins to very much accelerate after 1670. So the English are trying to get economic control, and then, of course, Bacon's Rebellion and King Philip's War kind of throws them off a little bit. But I think, especially in the case of King Philip's War, what the English wanted to do is to bring about a method by which they can control these colonies in a different manner. It really accelerates after 1660. The first thing they did, as just a refresher where we've been up to this point, are the Navigation Acts. The second is that by a royal decree, the English decide, this comes out from the king. The king decides what we're going to do is create this super colony that's going to exist. The super colony known as the Dominion of New England. Here it is. And this is organized in the 1680s. In 1686, we know that it had been part of the king's plan. This is Charles II. I decided that he was going to follow the advice of his brother and capture the Dutch colony of New Netherland and make it New York. The king's brother James, who would later become James II in the later part of the 1680s, had also been instrumental in putting this together. It's called the Dominion of New England. Why not, they say, better organize these very different colonies? One of the things that had really bothered the English monarchs is especially about Massachusetts. Massachusetts, that's the home of, again, John Winthrop and the Puritan migration of the 1630s. One of the things that had annoyed them is that the Massachusetts colonists were defying the Navigation Acts. They were great at smuggling. I mean, the sea trade is the backbone of the New England economy. And they were just laughing at the English, daring them to enforce the law. The other thing that really annoyed the English is that the Massachusetts colony prevented all non-Puritans from participating in government. You had to be a Puritan to vote, to serve in the Massachusetts General Court. That to the English is absolutely absurd. These these religious minorities were controlling the politics of that particular colony. So the king decided he was just going to tear up the Charter of Massachusetts. There was going to be a new government put in place. And the first step to bring compliance, to bring obedience from these colonies was to organize this super colony. You put all of the New England colonies together. You can see them. Maine was not a distinct colony. Maine wasn't Maine until 1820, believe it or not. A lot of people don't, I think, recognize that Maine is part of Massachusetts. There is no Vermont yet either. So they organized the New England colonies, along with the new colony of New York and the two Jerseys. It's still two Jersey colonies in the 1680s. And it's called the Dominion of New England, a super colony which should all be run by one individual. His name was Edmund Andros. You can see him here in his military attire. It makes logical sense. King Philip's War had just been a decade before. It devastated the Massachusetts countryside. It took a generation for the folks to rebuild the towns on the frontier in Massachusetts that had been absolutely burned and destroyed by King Philip and his Indian allies in 1675 and 1676. But behind this curtain of security was the idea that we're going to get the New England colonists and all of the colonies in North America to obey the trade laws and have obedience in religion. Why? The official Church of England, the Anglican Church. Anglicans can't vote in Massachusetts? You've got to be kidding me. This is what really, really offended the English monarchs. The Americans hate the laws passed after the Dominion of New England was created. They had been successful at smuggling. Andros is going to use the Navy, the British Navy, to make sure that smugglers are prosecuted. Andros wears out his welcome very, very quickly. He decides to enforce the trade laws. The nerve of the guy, right? Obedience to the English laws. The colonists don't like it. He brings in a lot of drinking, swearing soldiers to make sure that the trade laws are actually enforced right there along the New England towns and cities. They're not Puritans. They're not Congregationalists, many are these soldiers. The English, and to this day Americans, we don't like to have a large army in peacetime. We don't like to see soldiers doing non-soldierly things like enforcing the law and making sure that customs duties and taxes are all obeyed and everyone's happy that way. He also decides to, Andros, take away all of the old Puritan land titles. He's like, nope, they're done for. And also you Puritans, you Congregationalists, you'll have to share your meeting houses and your places of worship with Anglicans. Now the Congregationalists, the Puritans, remember, they left England and went on a 3,000-mile voyage to leave Anglicans in England. And now they have to worship together in the same building. This was really, really getting them upset. There are restrictions on the Puritan courts. Puritans as judges? Not anymore. Freedom of the press? Nah, it's going to be limited now. Things have to be approved by Andros. And as unpopular as Andros was in New England and in the greater Dominion of New England, it turns out that the King of England was just as unpopular. The new king, James II, comes to the throne in 1685 and 1686. What he does is makes him just as unpopular in England as Andros is in the American colonies. Here it is right here in the notes. James II tries to bring Catholicism back to England. Oh, no, not a good idea. Most people in England are pretty happy following the Anglican Church. When James's wife gives birth to a son, it creates a bad situation. Now, a lot of English people say, we're going to have James serving as an English king. His son will be christened as a Catholic. That's not what we want. And so a group of members of Parliament and Anglican, this is the official at the time Church of England. Anglican bishops and archbishops, they get together to get rid of James. They decide they're going to invite James's Protestant daughter, Mary, who's married to Prince William of the Netherlands. They're known as William and Mary. We know there's a college in Virginia named College of William and Mary. Well, this seems a good idea to bring them in as co-monarchs of England and a way to get James out of the picture. James II decides, rather than get locked up in the dank, smelly Tower of London, I'm going to flee England, because he tries to rally support, and it's like a record that's going, and all of a sudden, it comes to a stop. He's like, rally around me, James II, and everyone's like, nah, I don't think so. He was pretty unpopular, just like Edmund Andros and his changes in England and New England were unpopular. James was pretty unpopular in England itself. That's why in English history this is called the Glorious Revolution, because it's bloodless. William and Mary come with an army of Dutch soldiers and will now be the new king and queen of England. By leaving James II, the people in England say, well, you've abdicated the throne, you're done for. The Glorious Revolution in England becomes the Glorious Revolution in North America. Edmund Andros is captured, sent back to England. Massachusetts declares itself independent from the Dominion of New England, as do other colonies. Again, we hear rebellion, we hear revolution, the Glorious Revolution. In England, we saw what happened in the New England colonies. It's essentially saying we reject this new change. We don't reject England. People often confuse it. You hear rebellion and revolution, you're like, oh, independence. Nah, no one's saying that, not yet. Not for another almost 100 years. They're throwing out James's unpopular reforms. They're not throwing out their connection with England. They want things the way they were before. Glorious Revolution. All of a sudden, there are no more existence of the Dominion of New England. The new king and queen demand in Massachusetts that there is a new charter. The days of the Puritan domination in politics is over. And these events in the Dominion of New England and the breakdown of the Dominion of New England, King Philip's War, the new charter, the new king and queen, might have created a perfect scenario by which we see a series of events that will lead to a temporary, but no doubt fascinating, hysteria of witchcraft in a small coastal town called Salem. So we'll pick up that story next time and talk about the movement of people, non-English people, to the American colonies during the time from 1700 up to the advent of the American Revolution. So that's where the story will go next time.